In May of 1387, the elders of Isfahan walked out of their city gates carrying gold, carpets, and 300 of their own noblemen's sons as hostages. They were not fighting. They were surrendering. They had heard what happened to cities that resisted the army now camped outside their walls, and they had decided, wisely, that resistance was a death sentence. So they did exactly what you were supposed to do when an unstoppable army arrives at your gates. They opened them. They paid tribute. They handed over their own children as a guarantee of their loyalty. And it worked. The conqueror outside their walls, a lame, limping warlord named Timur, a man some of you may know as Tamerlane, accepted their surrender. He showed them mercy. No looting. No massacre. Isfahan, one of the great cultural cities of Persia, kept its libraries, its mosques, its people. For a few weeks, the city believed it had survived. Then a single uprising, a moment of panic during a night of Mongol soldiers looting a few homes, changed everything. And when it was over, eyewitnesses counted more than 28 separate towers, each one built from roughly 1,500 human skulls. Doing everything right didn't save them. Surrendering didn't save them. Mercy, it turned out, had an expiration date. This is the story of how a city that obeyed every rule of survival still ended up as 35 towers of bone, and how the man who built them would go on to kill an estimated 17 million people across his lifetime. Roughly 5% of the entire population of the world at that time. Keep that number in your head, 35 towers. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly how a man decided that number, and why mercy meant nothing once he'd made up his mind. To understand how a city full of cooperative, surrendering civilians ended up dead anyway, you need to understand the mind of the man who killed them. And that mind was built on something most conquerors never had to deal with: total physical disability, earned the hard way. Timur was born around 1336 near Samarkand, in what is now Uzbekistan. He came from the Barlas tribe, Turkic-Mongol people, but crucially, not royalty. Not Genghisid blood. In a world where legitimacy to rule was supposed to come from bloodline, Timur had none of it. He would have to build his own legitimacy from nothing, through marriage, through alliances, through sheer accumulated terror. His early life wasn't glamorous. By most accounts, young Timur ran with a small band of raiders, the kind of men who stole sheep, horses, and cattle from travelers just to survive. And it was during one of these raids, sometime around 1363, that Timur's life changed permanently. Accounts vary, but the most common version says he was shot by 2 arrows while trying to steal a flock of sheep. One through his right leg, one through his right hand, costing him 2 fingers. Both wounds disabled him for the rest of his life. He would walk with a permanent limp from that day forward. And from that limp came the name history would remember him by: Timur Ilang. Timur the Lame. Western chroniclers would later twist that into Tamerlane, the name that survived into our language 8 centuries later. Here's what's important. Timur didn't let this slow him down, and he didn't let it define him as weak. If anything, the opposite happened. By around 1370, this disabled former bandit had clawed his way to leadership of the Western Chagatai Khanate, one of the fractured pieces left behind after the Mongol Empire splintered a century earlier. And Timur had a very specific role model: Genghis Khan. He deliberately positioned himself as Genghis Khan's spiritual heir, emulating his tactics, his speed, his use of terror as a weapon, but adding something Genghis Khan never quite had: a love of architecture, poetry, and culture, which he indulged in his capital, Samarkand, while practicing horrifying violence everywhere else. For the next 35 years, Timur would barely stop fighting. He spent the final decades of his life in what amounted to constant, rolling conquest, first consolidating Central Asia, then turning his attention toward the much richer, much older civilization sitting just to his southwest, Persia. But here's what separates Timur from a simple steppe warlord, and why understanding his personality matters so much to understanding what happens at Isfahan. Timur wasn't an uneducated brute swinging a sword. By every account from people who actually met him, including European ambassadors who later visited his court, he was sharp, calculating, and genuinely fascinated by culture. He spoke Persian fluently and used it constantly in conversation. His personal motto, in Persian, translated to "truth is safety." He played a more complex version of chess that historians believe he invented himself, on an overs. The uprising killed Timur's tax collectors. It also killed a number of his soldiers. Accounts suggest the death toll on Timur's side ran into the thousands. By some estimates, around 3,000 of his men killed in the chaos of that single night. Let that sink in for a moment, because it explains everything that follows. This wasn't a symbolic protest or a minor skirmish. This was a coordinated, violent uprising that killed a meaningful portion of an occupying garrison in a single night, the kind of event that, in the brutal calculus of any conqueror in this era, demanded an unmistakable response. Timur was reportedly elsewhere at the time the uprising occurred, and when word reached him, by every account, his reaction was immediate and absolute. There would be no negotiation. There would be no partial punishment. The city that had surrendered peacefully, that had handed over its own children as collateral for good behavior, was about to learn that none of that mattered anymore. He turned his army back toward Isfahan. The city, lacking any real military force of its own, it had, after all, surrendered without a fight specifically because it had no ability to resist, fell again almost instantly. There was no second siege in any meaningful military sense. There was only the arrival of an army that intended to make an example so severe that no city in Persia would ever consider rebellion again. What Timur ordered next is one of the most methodically documented acts of mass violence in the medieval world, methodical specifically because Timur wanted it documented. This wasn't violence meant to be forgotten. This was violence meant to be remembered, repeated as warning for centuries. He ordered the massacre of the city's population, specifically targeting those associated with the resistance, though by every surviving account the scale went far beyond any reasonable definition of those responsible. Historical estimates of the death toll vary, with most modern historians citing a figure of around 70,000 killed, though some contemporary chronicles inflated the number as high as 200,000, likely for the same psychological effect Timur himself was going for. Here is the detail that separates Timur from a simple, chaotic mass murderer and makes him something far colder and more calculated. His massacres were selective. Artisans, architects, poets, scholars, the educated and the artistically skilled were systematically spared and instead deported back to his capital at Samarkand, where Timur was simultaneously building one of the most architecturally magnificent cities in the entire world using the talent he'd extracted from the very cities he was destroying. Think about what that means. The same campaign that produced 35 towers of human skulls also produced master craftsmen who would go on to build some of the most celebrated Islamic architecture in human history. Timur wasn't simply destroying civilizations. He was harvesting them, keeping what he found useful, and turning everything else into a monument of warning. For the ordinary people of Isfahan, the merchants, the farmers, the soldiers, anyone without a specialized skill Timur's empire needed, there was no escape clause. His soldiers rounded up the condemned by the thousands. And then came the part that turned this from a massacre into a message. Here is what made Timur's brutality different from almost every other conqueror in history, including the man he modeled himself after. The bodies of the dead weren't simply left where they fell. Timur's soldiers collected the severed heads of the dead and methodically arranged them into towers, not careless, chaotic heaps of bone, but carefully engineered, symmetrical structures, built layer by layer like a mason building a wall. An eyewitness present at the time counted more than 28 separate towers, each one built from approximately 1,500 human skulls, putting the total number of heads used in construction somewhere north of 40,000, not counting the additional tens of thousands killed, but not incorporated into the structures themselves. This is the detail that should genuinely disturb you more than the raw body count. These were not spontaneous acts of rage. You cannot accidentally build a geometrically precise pyramid out of human skulls. This required organization, planning, and time, soldiers methodically stacking heads in formation while the city around them still smoldered. Modern historians studying the broader pattern of Timur's conquests describe these skull towers as a deliberate instrument of psychological warfare, not chaos, but communication. The message embedded in every tower was simple and brutally effective. Resistance doesn't just mean death. It means your remains become a permanent, visible warning to every traveler, every merchant, every rival king who passes by for years afterward. And it worked exactly. So let's go back to where we started. A city that opened its gates, handed over its children as hostages, paid its tribute, and did absolutely everything a medieval city was supposed to do to survive an unstoppable army. It survived for a few weeks. Then a single uprising, born from resentment over new taxes layered on top of an already emptied treasury, ended that survival permanently, and ended it in a form so deliberate, so architecturally precise, that historians are still studying its construction over 600 years later. The lesson Timur intended to teach Persia in 1387 wasn't really about Isfahan specifically. It was about the absolute, unconditional nature of submission under his rule. Surrender wasn't a contract. It was a temporary suspension of violence that could be revoked the instant he decided it should be. And there was no court, no appeal, no amount of prior good behavior that could buy back that mercy once it was withdrawn. Isfahan's libraries eventually recovered. Its mosques still stand today. But for the roughly 70,000 people who became part of 28 towers in the summer of 1387, there was no version of that story where doing everything right was ever going to be enough. Timur went on to build an empire stretching from the Mediterranean to the edges of India, patronizing some of the greatest architecture and scholarship of the medieval Islamic world, built, in no small part, by the very artisans his armies had spared specifically because of what they were skilled enough to create. He died in 1405, on his way to invade Ming China, having never lost a major military campaign in over 3 decades of constant war. If you want to see what happened when this same machine of calculated terror turned toward Delhi and Baghdad next, where the tower count got even higher, that's the next video. Subscribe so you don't miss it.